5 real-life stories of dark web visits gone terribly wrong. Story number 1. By Martin Reddy. In 2019, my life was in shambles. My business had gone under, my marriage was falling apart, and I was consumed by an anger I couldn't control. The source of that anger was a man named Darren, a former business associate I once trusted. Darren was charming and persuasive, but he was also ruthless. Over time, he'd undermined me, poached my clients, and taken credit for projects I'd worked tirelessly on. When my business finally collapsed, I was left with nothing, and Darren was thriving. Every time I saw his name in the news or heard about his latest success, it felt like another knife in my back. The anger started as a low simmer, but quickly grew into something much darker. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. All I could think about was how much I hated him and how unfair it all was. The idea of revenge began to take root in my mind, and soon it was all I could focus on. At first, it was just fantasies, thinking about ways to ruin his reputation or sabotage his projects. But as the weeks went on, those fantasies turned into something far more sinister. One sleepless night, while scrolling through forums about business failures and the people who'd caused them, I came across a post about the dark web. It was a term I'd heard before, always in a vague and mysterious context, but I'd never considered exploring it. The post talked about the hidden corners of the internet, where you could find anything, no matter how illegal or immoral. Drugs, weapons, stolen identities, and, disturbingly, hitmen. I should have stopped reading. I should have walked away, but I didn't. Curiosity and rage drove me deeper. I downloaded the Tor browser, set up a secure VPN, and spent hours fumbling through poorly designed websites and cryptic forums. It felt like opening a door to another world, a darker, more dangerous world where morality had no place. That's when I found it. Online Killer's Market. The site was disturbingly polished, with a sleek black and red interface and a bold tagline that read, "Problem solved, discretion guaranteed." The homepage featured testimonials from supposed clients. "Fast, reliable, and worth every Bitcoin," one read. Another said, "They handled my issue in under a week. Will definitely use again." It was surreal, like reading reviews for a restaurant, except the service was murder. A part of me still didn't believe it was real, but another part, the angry, vengeful part, wanted it to be. I stared at the register button for what felt like hours. My hands were shaking as I clicked it. Creating an account felt like crossing a line I could never come back from, but I kept going. I used a fake name, Evil Jesus, a ridiculous alias I thought would add another layer of anonymity. Once inside, I was guided through a series of steps to place an order. The form asked for the target's name, address, daily routine, and even their photo. They even asked for preferred methods of execution, a detail that made my stomach churn. I hesitated. This was insane. Was I really going to do this? But the anger was louder than my conscience. I convinced myself Darren deserved it, that this was justice, not murder. I filled out the form, uploading every detail I could about Darren. The final step was payment, 5 Bitcoin, roughly $5,000 at the time. I had no idea how to buy cryptocurrency, but I spent the next few hours figuring it out, driven by pure adrenaline. When I clicked submit, a confirmation message appeared. Job accepted. Updates will follow. My heart raced as I stared at the screen. I felt a strange mix of relief and fear. It was done. There was no turning back now. The first few days were torturous. I couldn't focus on anything, constantly refreshing the site for updates. Eventually, I received a message from the supposed hitman. He claimed the job was underway, but requested more funds to ensure success. Furious but desperate, I transferred another $2,000. This pattern repeated over the next 2 weeks. More excuses, more demands for money. I began to suspect I was being scammed, But before I could act, my world came crashing down. One evening, as I sat at my computer, I received an email from an anonymous address. The subject line read, "We know what you're doing." My heart stopped. The message was short but chilling. "The police are watching. Delete everything." Minutes later, my phone rang. The voice on the other end was cold and authoritative. "Mr. Reddy, this is Detective Harris. We need to talk about your online activity." I froze. They knew. The police had intercepted my Bitcoin transactions and traced them back to me. I was arrested that night in front of my neighbors, handcuffed and humiliated. As I sat in the back of the police car, the reality of what I'd done hit me like a freight train. I had tried to have someone killed. My hatred for Darren had turned me into someone unrecognizable, someone I despised. In court, it came out that the website was a scam. There were no hitmen, no murders, just criminals exploiting desperate, angry people like me. But that didn't matter. The evidence was damning. The emails, the payments, the details I'd provided about Darren, all of it painted a picture of a man willing to go to horrifying lengths for revenge. I was convicted of attempted murder and sentenced to years in prison. Sitting in my cell, I had nothing but time to think. I realized that Darren wasn't the one who had destroyed my life. I was. My anger and obsession had consumed me, blinding me to everything else. The dark web hadn't just offered me a way to lash out. It had offered me a mirror, forcing me to confront the darkest parts of myself. Even now, years later, I'm haunted by what I did. The stigma follows me everywhere. I can't find work, my family won't speak to me, and I'm a cautionary tale in my own community. Darren moved on with his life, oblivious to how close he came to being a victim of my rage. Meanwhile, I'm left to pick up the pieces of a life I shattered with my own hands. The dark web isn't a playground. It's not a curiosity or a thrill. It's a Pandora's box that preys on your worst impulses. I thought it would give me power, but all it gave me was regret. If you ever feel tempted to explore it, ask yourself, are you prepared to lose everything? I wasn't. And now, I'll live with that choice for the rest of my life. Story number 2, by David Laycock. Losing a child is the kind of pain that no parent should ever have to endure. When I think of my son Connor, I don't think about the struggle that consumed the last years of his life. I think about the laughter that lit up our home, the way he used to play with his daughter, and the boundless potential he had. But the dark web took all of that away from him, and from us. Connor's struggle began like so many others do, with a legitimate prescription. After an injury at work, he was prescribed painkillers to manage the discomfort. At first, he followed the doctor's orders, but as his tolerance grew, he began taking more than he should. When his prescription ran out, he turned to the streets to get what he thought he needed to function. He was always so clever. Connor could figure out anything if he put his mind to it. That's how he ended up on the dark web. I didn't even know what it was at the time. Some hidden part of the internet where anonymity reigns. It was there that he discovered just how easy it was to get the pills he craved. A few clicks, a Bitcoin transaction, and within days, a package would arrive at our house under a fake name. The first time I found one of those packages, I didn't think much of it. I assumed it was something he'd ordered online, a tool for work or some gadget he was tinkering with. But one day, curiosity got the better of me. I opened one of the packages and found a bag of pills inside. They were loose, unmarked, and came with no instructions. When I confronted Connor, he shrugged it off like it was no big deal. "Don't worry about it, Dad," he said. "It's nothing I can't handle." But it wasn't nothing. Over the next few months, I watched as my son spiraled deeper into addiction. He started losing weight, his face grew hollow, and the spark that had always defined him began to fade. His daughter, just a toddler at the time, would tug on his arm, begging him to play. but he barely had the energy to get off the couch. I tried to help him, to get him to go to rehab, but he was stubborn. He thought he had it under control. The night he died started like any other. He came home late, looking tired but otherwise fine. He kissed his daughter goodnight and went to his room. I checked on him around midnight, and he was sitting at his desk, scrolling on his computer. "Good night, Dad," he said with a tired smile. I didn't know it would be the last thing he ever said to me. The next morning, I went to wake him up, but he didn't respond. I shook him, called his name, but he was cold. His lips were blue, and there was a bag of pills on his desk, the same kind I'd found in those packages. I called 911, but it was too late. He was gone. The coroner's report confirmed what I already knew: multi-drug toxicity. The pills he'd taken weren't what he thought they were. They were laced with fentanyl and other synthetic opioids, far more potent than anything he'd taken before. One pill was enough to kill him, and he'd taken several. After his death, I became obsessed with understanding what had happened. I went through his computer, tracing his steps on the dark web. What I found was horrifying. The marketplaces where he bought his pills operated like Amazon, with reviews, seller ratings, and anonymous transactions. One seller even boasted about the strength of their product, calling it the real deal. But it wasn't real. It was poison. I reported the sites to the authorities, but they told me there was little they could do. These sites are constantly moving, changing addresses, and encrypting their operations. They thrive in the shadows, preying on people like my son, who are desperate and vulnerable. The worst part is knowing how close we were to saving him. Connor had talked about wanting to quit, about being there for his daughter and building a better life. But the dark web made it too easy for him to slip back into old habits. It gave him access to something he thought he could control, and it killed him. Now, every time I see his daughter, I see the void he left behind. She's too young to understand why her daddy isn't here anymore. But one day, I'll have to explain it to her. I'll have to tell her that the dark web stole him from us, that it preyed on his pain and turned it into profit. If I could go back and stop him from clicking that first link, I would. But I can't. All I can do now is tell his story and hope it serves as a warning. The dark web isn't a game or a curiosity. It's a predator, waiting to devour anyone who gets too close. And once it takes someone, there's no getting them back. Story number 3, by Alex Marshall. In 2022, my best friend Jetson and I were two young guys living our best lives in Melbourne. We worked as tradies, fixing up homes and dreaming about starting our own business one day. Jetson was the life of the party, always cracking jokes, pulling pranks, and finding ways to turn even the most boring day into an adventure. He had this energy about him, like nothing could ever go wrong. He was invincible, or at least, that's what we thought. Jetson was always into the latest trends and tech. He loved showing off new gadgets or apps he'd discovered, and he was the first in our group to talk about the dark web. It started as a joke during a late-night conversation at his place. "You ever heard of it?" he asked, leaning back in his chair with a mischievous grin. "The dark web, where all the shady stuff happens?" "Yeah," I said, laughing. "Isn't that where people buy illegal crap? Like drugs or, I don't know, hitmen?" "Exactly," he said, his eyes lighting up. "But it's not just that. You can find literally anything on there. It's wild." At first, I thought he was bluffing, trying to sound cool. But then he pulled out his laptop, opened the Tor browser, and started navigating through these hidden websites like it was no big deal. Most of the sites looked sketchy, with grainy images and clunky layouts, but Jetson seemed unfazed. "Look at this," he said, clicking on a listing for prescription pills. "Oxycodone, dirt cheap, and they deliver it right to your door." I laughed nervously, assuming he was just messing around. But then he added the pills to his cart, paid with Bitcoin, and confirmed the order. My stomach dropped. "Dude, You're actually buying this stuff? Relax, he said, waving me off. I've done it before. These guys have reviews, like eBay. It's legit. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to tell him to stop, but another part figured he knew what he was doing. Jetson had always been the risk-taker, the guy who jumped headfirst into things without hesitation. I figured he'd try the pills a couple of times and move on to something else. When the package arrived a few days later, it was small and nondescript, just a plain brown envelope with no return address. Inside was a bag of loose pills, unmarked and unsealed. Jetson was thrilled. "See?" he said, holding them up. "Easy as that." He popped one immediately, leaning back on the couch with a satisfied smile. "This is the good stuff, man," he said. "None of that watered-down pharmacy crap." At first, it seemed harmless. Jetson would take a pill or two at parties, joking about how he was living the high life. But over the next few weeks, I started noticing changes. He was taking the pills more often, even during the day. He'd show up to work looking tired, his eyes bloodshot and unfocused. He started skipping plans, making excuses about feeling sick or needing to rest. One night, I confronted him. "Jetson, what's going on with you? You're not yourself lately." "I'm fine," he said, brushing me off. "I've just been working too hard. Don't worry about me." But I did worry. I could see the toll it was taking on him, even if he couldn't or wouldn't admit it. The last time I saw Jetson was at a party. He was in his usual spot, cracking jokes and making everyone laugh. At one point, he pulled out a bag of pills and started handing them out like candy. "Come on, Alex," he said, grinning at me. "Live a little." I refused, telling him he needed to slow down. He just laughed and popped another pill. "I know my limits," he said, raising his beer in a mock toast. The next morning, I got a call from his sister. Her voice was shaking, and I could barely make out what she was saying. "Alex, Jetson's gone." At first, I didn't understand. "Gone where?" I asked, my heart racing. She started crying. "He didn't wake up. We found him this morning. He's gone." I dropped the phone. The world felt like it had stopped. Jetson, my best friend, my brother, was dead. The coroner's report confirmed what I already suspected. He'd overdosed on the pills he'd bought from the dark web. But what I didn't expect was the additional detail that made my stomach churn. The pills weren't oxycodone. They were laced with nitazene, a synthetic opioid far more potent than fentanyl. Even a small dose could be lethal, and Jetson had taken several. I was furious. Furious at the people who sold him the pills. Furious at the dark web for making it so easy. And furious at myself for not doing more to stop him. I kept replaying our conversations in my head, wondering if there was something I could have said or done to change the outcome. In the weeks after his death, I went down a rabbit hole of research, trying to understand the dark web and the networks that operated there. What I found was horrifying. These suppliers didn't care about their customers. They cared about profits. They cut drugs with dangerous substances to save money, knowing full well that people like Jetson would pay the price. I reported the site Jetson had used to the authorities, but they told me there was little they could do. These sites pop up and disappear constantly, moving to new servers and changing their addresses to avoid detection. It felt like a losing battle. Jetson's funeral was one of the hardest days of my life. His parents were inconsolable. His sister kept asking why no one had stopped him, and his daughter, just a toddler, was too young to understand why her daddy wasn't coming home. Standing by his grave, I made a promise to myself. I would never let anyone I cared about go down the same path. To this day, I can't shake the guilt. Every time I think about Jetson, I see his grin, hear his laugh, and remember the way he handed me that bag of pills, telling me to live a little. He thought he was invincible, that he could handle anything. But the dark web doesn't care how strong you think you are. It chews you up and spits you out without a second thought. If you're thinking about exploring it, don't. It's not worth the risk. The dark web isn't a playground. It's a trap. And once it takes someone you love, there's no way to get them back. I learned that lesson the hard way, and I'll carry the weight of it for the rest of my life. Story number 4. By Mia Carter. In 2020, during the height of the global lockdown, my life had become a monotonous cycle of work-from-home meetings, streaming shows, and scrolling endlessly on social media. It felt like time had lost all meaning. Boredom was my constant companion, and I started looking for something new to occupy my mind. That's when I stumbled across a discussion thread about the dark web. The people on the forum described it like a hidden world, a place where anything could be found if you were curious or reckless enough to look. Drugs, weapons, black market goods, and even services I didn't want to believe were real. To me, it sounded both terrifying and fascinating. I wasn't looking for anything illegal, just a way to scratch an itch of curiosity. I wanted to see if the dark web was as sinister as people claimed. After days of research, I finally figured out how to access it. I downloaded the Tor browser, set up a VPN to protect my identity, and read endless guides on staying anonymous. The first few sites I found were disappointing. Basic marketplaces selling counterfeit items or outdated forums filled with poorly written posts. It wasn't until I found a chat room buried deep in one of the directories that things started to feel different. The chat room wasn't flashy, just a black screen with a list of anonymous usernames and an open text box. At first, the conversations seemed harmless. People were talking about hacking, conspiracy theories, and strange websites they'd visited. I joined in, sharing a few jokes and asking questions. It was exciting in a strange way, like I'd stepped into a secret club. That's when I noticed someone named Nightcrawler messaging me directly. At first, his messages seemed normal. He asked how I'd found the chat room and if I was new to the dark web. I was cautious but curious, so I answered vaguely. "Just exploring," I replied, trying to see what all the hype is about. He seemed friendly, offering tips about staying safe online and suggesting sites to check out. But as the conversation continued, his questions became more personal. "Where are you from?" he asked. I dodged the question, saying I lived somewhere in the US. He pressed further, asking about my city and my job. When I hesitated, he said, "You can trust me. I just like knowing who I'm talking to." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I told him I didn't share personal information online, thinking that would end the conversation. But he didn't stop. "Come on," he replied. "It's just us here. No one's watching." I logged out of the chat room, my unease growing, but I tried to convince myself it was harmless, just some lonely guy trying to make a connection. The next day, I received an email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line read, "Hello, Mia." My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't used my real name anywhere online, not even in my personal email accounts. When I opened the message, there was no text, just a photo of my house, taken from the street. I stared at the screen, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was a coincidence, a prank. But then another email arrived. This one had a closer photo, taken from my backyard. It was of my bedroom window, and the sight of it made my stomach churn. That night, I locked every door and window in the house, pulling the curtains shut in every room. My mind was racing. How had someone found me? I hadn't given out my name, let alone my address. It didn't make sense. The emails kept coming, and they were getting more personal. One included a photo of me sitting on my couch, taken through the living room window. Another said simply, "Nice pajamas." The realization that someone had been outside my home, watching me, left me paralyzed with fear. I reported everything to the police, but their response was disheartening. "Without a direct threat or evidence of a crime, there's not much we can do," the officer said. He suggested installing security cameras and staying vigilant, but his words didn't ease my growing paranoia. The worst night came about a week later. I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when I heard footsteps on the gravel path outside. They were slow, deliberate, and far too close to my bedroom window. My breath caught in my throat. I reached for my phone, but before I could call 911, there was a soft tapping on the glass. My blood ran cold. The tapping continued, rhythmic and deliberate, as if whoever was outside wanted to make sure I knew they were there. Summoning every ounce of courage, I crept out of bed and peeked through the corner of the curtain. In the faint glow of the security light, I saw a shadowy figure standing just outside the window. I didn't wait to see more. I dialed 911, whispering to the operator that someone was outside my house. The minutes until the police arrived felt like hours. I stayed crouched in the corner of my bedroom, heart pounding, until I saw the flashing red and blue lights outside. When the officers searched the property, they found footprints in the gravel and a single smudged handprint on the bedroom window. But the person was gone. "If they come back, call us immediately," one officer said. I nodded, but I knew I wouldn't sleep that night, or any night soon. After that, the emails stopped, and the footsteps never returned. But the damage was done. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every knock at the door, every shadow outside the window, sent my heart racing. I moved to a new apartment, installed cameras, and deleted every account I had used to access the dark web. To this day, I don't know who Nightcrawler was or how he found me. Was he a skilled hacker, a local predator who got lucky, or part of something even larger and more sinister? I'll never know, and maybe that's for the best. The dark web isn't just a hidden corner of the internet. It's a predator's playground. It thrives on fear and curiosity, drawing in people like me who think they're just exploring. But once you step into that world, it doesn't let you leave unscathed. If you're thinking about going there, ask yourself if you're ready for the consequences. I thought I was. I wasn't. And now, I'll never feel safe again. Story number 5, by Nathan Reeves. In 2018, my fascination with the macabre pushed me to explore the edges of the internet. I'd always been drawn to true crime, conspiracy theories, and the darker aspects of human nature. So when I read about the dark web on a forum, I knew I had to see it for myself. People talked about it like it was a hidden world, a place where anything was possible if you had the curiosity and nerve. At the time, I didn't understand that curiosity and nerve could lead to consequences I'd never recover from. I spent days figuring out how to access the dark web. I downloaded the Tor browser, read guides on staying anonymous, and stumbled through link after link before finding something that both terrified and intrigued me. It was a dark web auction site, but instead of selling stolen electronics or counterfeit goods, it was selling people. The homepage was simple but horrifying, a list of products that were actually human beings. The photos were haunting, some blurred, others shockingly clear. Each listing had a description: gender, approximate age, physical condition, and cryptic notes like docile or strong-willed. I wanted to believe it was fake. I wanted to believe this was some sort of elaborate scam or an online performance meant to scare outsiders. But the more I scrolled, the more convincing it became. I noticed a blinking notification at the top of the screen. Live auction starting soon. Click to join. My heart pounded as I hovered over the link. Every instinct told me to close the browser, but I clicked it anyway. The screen went black, then loaded a live video feed of a dimly lit room. A woman was seated in the center of the room, her hands tied behind her back, a blindfold covering her eyes. She was trembling, her shoulders shaking as she tried to suppress quiet sobs. The room was silent, except for her unsteady breathing. Then a man stepped into the frame. He was wearing a black mask and gloves, his face completely obscured. "Lot 47, he said in a cold, detached voice. Female, early 20s, excellent health, no history of drug use or medical complications, obedient. He walked over to the woman and placed a hand on her shoulder. She flinched, but didn't cry out. My stomach churned as he tilted her chin toward the camera, forcing her into full view. The auction began immediately. Numbers started flooding the chat box, bids in Bitcoin, climbing higher and higher. My hands shook as I watched the numbers rise, the bidders hidden behind anonymous usernames. Some of the comments were chilling. Perfect for labor. Beautiful. Worth every coin. It was like they were discussing a piece of furniture, not a human being. I wanted to close the browser, but I felt paralyzed. My eyes were glued to the screen, horrified, but unable to look away. The woman began to cry softly, and I could hear her whispering, "Please, someone help me." Her voice was faint, but it shattered any lingering doubts I had about whether this was real. As the bids climbed past 50 Bitcoin, more money than I'd ever seen in my life, I finally snapped out of my trance. I slammed my laptop shut, my heart racing. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the closed lid, trying to convince myself it wasn't real. But I knew better. The next day, I reported the site to the police. I gave them the URL, described the auction, and shared everything I could remember. But their response was disheartening. "The dark web is nearly impossible to trace," the officer said. "These sites move constantly, and even if we locate the server, it's likely overseas and out of our jurisdiction." Frustrated and guilty, I started researching human trafficking and dark web networks on my own. What I found was worse than anything I could have imagined. The auction I'd seen was just one of many. These sites operated in the shadows, catering to a global network of buyers who treated people like commodities. Many of the victims were abducted, others sold by criminal organizations, and some were lured into traps by promises of work or safety. Weeks later, I received an anonymous email. The subject line read, "You were watching." Attached was a photo of me, taken through the window of my apartment. My blood ran cold. Somehow, they knew who I was. I deleted everything, my accounts, my browser history, all traces of my dark web activity. I even moved to a new apartment, but I couldn't shake the paranoia. Every time I heard a knock at the door or saw a shadow outside my window, my heart leapt into my throat. The woman from the auction still haunts me. I see her face every time I close my eyes, her trembling hands, her whispered plea for help. Did she survive? Was she saved? Or was she delivered to one of those faceless buyers, lost forever in the underworld of human trafficking? I'll never know. The dark web isn't just a hidden corner of the internet. It's a mirror reflecting humanity's darkest impulses. If you're thinking about exploring it, ask yourself if you're ready to see something that will stay with you for the rest of your life. I thought I was prepared. I wasn't. And now, I'll never be able to forget.